Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mary Ann Vernetson, and I'm the Associate Director here at the Bob Graham Center for Public Service at the University of Florida in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Thank you for joining us this evening for our program with double-Gator grad and renowned Florida architect and author Mario Cartaya. Mr. Cartaya is not only a personal friend of former Florida Governor and Senator Bob Graham, but also served for more than 15 years as chair of the Senator's Air Force and Naval Academies selection committees. Mr. Cartaya received his Bachelor of Architecture in 1974 and Master's in Building Construction in 1975, both from UF's College of Design, Construction, and Planning. He is also an active board member of the Cuba Study Group and helped advise U.S. Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama with the development of their foreign policies toward Cuba. Bringing such experienced professionals as Mr. Cartaya furthers our role as UF's leading center for civic engagement, public leadership, and public service. I also want to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsor this evening, UF's College of Design, Construction, and Planning. As you will soon learn, Mr. Cartaya is a charismatic and engaging individual who speaks from the heart about his return to his homeland after 56 years. And he will also share a select number of images from his trip to support his compelling narrative. Our moderator for this evening is Dr. Carlos Suarez, an associate instructional professor in the Center for Latin American Studies and the Department of Political Science. He is also an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. Now for a few final housekeeping items before we begin. Please silence your cell phones, and if you are watching from home, please use the bubble in the bottom right corner of your screen to submit your own question during the Q&A portion of the program. Now please join me in welcoming Mario. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Ann, for this wonderful introduction, and it is indeed an honor for me to be here in a building named after Bob Graham, a great personal friend and a man that has been an inspiration, not just to me, but to Floridians for so long. It's wonderful to be here and read from my book in this beautiful place of honesty and beauty and good citizenship. Starting in late 1959, Cuba's new revolutionary government embarked upon a campaign to document and nationalize all American properties and businesses throughout Cuba. My father, Ignacio, owned a business specializing in accounting and retail sales of American-made Frigidaire and Sylvania products. His clients' records, including the locations and value of all investments throughout the islands, were meticulously kept in his company's business ledgers. The government's American confiscation efforts eventually found my father at his business address. One fateful morning in 1960, two armed militia personnel barged into his office looking for his ledgers. It did not go well for my father. With the rebels aggressively walking around his office, yelling threats and demanding his records, my father faced his worst fears as he contemplated their abusive personal attacks, unlawful demands, and rapidly escalating challenges to his business versus his need to just survive the day. In the end, my dad's righteousness prevailed. He refused to give them anything. My father's defiance of the rebels' demands that day, however, culminated in an argument that ultimately led to his detention. During his confinement, my dad was escorted to a meeting with Cuban revolutionary officials for an interrogation that quickly turned into accusations, lectures, and threats, until finally concluding with an order to surrender his business ledgers before the end of the day. With no judicial request supporting their demands, my dad bravely refused again. Furious with his perceived insubordination, the lead interrogator, guerrilla commander Che Guevara, arose from behind his desk, aggressively approached my father and proceeded to berate him and threaten him in a brutal and sustained tirade of anger. Life was cheap during the early days of the Cuban Revolution. My dad's defiance of Cuban military authority that day had placed his life in real and imminent danger. A lieutenant, friends with my father since childhood, fortunately intervened and convinced Guevara that he would personally ensure that my dad complied with his demands. My father would eventually hand over his ledgers, and the rebels did in fact back down. Unfortunately, he was now blacklisted by Castro's revolutionary regime and warned that his future safety in Cuba was no longer guaranteed. That day, my father's life was mercifully spared, but his fate, as well as ours, was sealed. My mother, father, brother, and I would have to leave Cuba. Before our planned departure in November, however, my father wanted us to simultaneously discover and say goodbye to the land of our birth. One cloudless morning in 1960, my parents, brother, and I slid in our blue and white 1957 Ford sedan and drove on a farewell tour of Cuba towards Vinales Valley before turning around and continuing to Santiago in the east, stopping at several coastal villages, hamlets, and historical towns along the way. Once we reached Santiago, my father and I attended Mass at Cuba's holiest shrine, La Basílica del Cobre, and prayed for the Virgin of Charity to protect us during our exile and care for the loved ones in Cuba that we were soon to leave behind. A few weeks after our Cuban farewell trip, on November 13 of 1960, my father, mother, brother, and I prepared to leave our home in Havana for the short drive to Jose Marti International Airport. My grandmother, succumbed by an unimaginable and uncontrollable grief, locked herself up in her bedroom. My grandfather put on a brave face and mustered a smile as he hugged and kissed us goodbye. My uncle Miguel drove us to the airport. We would never see one another again. Once airborne, the sounds of the airplane's engines continuously marked the passage of time and distance away from our home and the loved ones we were leaving behind. Every rotation of the propeller blades bringing us closer to an uncertain future in a new land. Inside the cabin, everything was eerily quiet except for the recurrent sobbing from some of the passengers. 45 minutes later, we arrived in Miami. That day, I had slept in Havana, woke up the day of our departure, and left Cuba as a Cuban national. By nightfall of the same day, I slept in Miami as an exile in a strange land. My life had changed. Because my life had changed, and being, of course, having just turned 9, what does a 9-year-old want? To play, to make friends, to try hot dogs. I mean, why do Americans eat dogs anyways, right? To try, I don't know, root beer, hamburgers, to learn the game of football. It's all new to me. I created a protective subconscious vault to protect me from the irrelevance of my Cuban childhood, the pain of having to now change everything, my language, my culture, right? My mores, the way I behaved, the way I looked, everything. During the first few years, in the early 1960s, there was little, if any, communication with Cuba. It was an era defined by the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, numerous ill-conceived and executed American attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, and the nearly apocalyptic Cuban Missile Crisis. As a result, travel to Cuba was prohibited. Telephone access became impossibly restricted, and mail service was at best unreliable. By the time President Kennedy negotiated an end to the Cuban Missile Crisis and enacted a policy of maximum pressure on Cuba's now Marxist-Leninist government, most forms of communication with Cuba stopped. Our American exile had now become permanent. My maternal grandparents, uncle, and aunts became ill, very ill, in Cuba during that time. Unable to travel there during their final days alive, my parents searched for ways to stay in contact with them. Without reliable telephone service or mail delivery, our only form of communication became frustratingly limited to short and often encrypted telegraphs. Maximum 8 words. Never had our family separation seemed so great or the distance between us so far. By 1968, they were all gone. We never saw them again. We never said goodbye. My entire family disappeared. I buried the suffering caused by their deaths, including the feelings of guilt and impotence. That's a word that I use quite often, the impotence of politics, of not being able to do what you need to do because the politics prohibits you. But the impotence associated with our inability to see them during their time of need inside the same protective vault I had already built. My protective subconscious vault worked well, maybe too well. In time, I stopped feeling its presence or the contents I once buried inside. 56 years later, now a highly successful and acclaimed American architect, I felt an innate need to breach my protective subconscious vault in search of the Cuban identity and childhood memories I once discarded to a life of obscurity inside the vault's silent and dark walls. I did not know what I would find there if I did come in. I did not know the effects it would have on my life. I just knew I had to try. I had reached a point in my life where I needed to make peace with myself, conquer the unknown demons that I felt lurking within me, and find the missing pages of my Cuban story. I wanted to recover a lifetime of lost memories and achieve those closures long denied. Instinctively, I knew I would have to travel to Cuba and walk on the faded footprints of my childhood steps in order to succeed. I hope that the stimulus of the places synonymous with the first 8 years of my life would somehow, against all odds, return those memories. A siren song had awakened deep within me and was calling me back to the land of my birth. It was time to return to Cuba. On November 13, 1960, a young boy, scared and nervous, was playfully lifted by an imaginary little red crane from his Havana living room and gently dropped off in Miami. 56 years later, on May 16, 2016, a grown man in need of repairing the torn and frayed tapestry of his life, longing to find the images of his early childhood and hopeful of bonding with the people and land he once fled, finally returned to the country of his forgotten memories. An existential tale of retracing the footprints of your childhood steps, facing your past, achieving closures once denied, and finding that inner peace, redemption, and forgiveness necessary to reach the clarity of mind and purity of heart required to discover the true meaning and essence of our lives. I returned to Cuba. During the early 1950s, my family rented our homes in the Carmen and Sevillano districts of Havana. By early 1959, with my father's business growing, increasingly prosperous, and our family finances improving accordingly, we bought a new house being built in a suburban development called Reparto Apolo. My friends and I had no problems finding San Leonardo Street on the first day of my return to Cuba. I recognized it as soon as we drove past it. Dell, our driver, parked our car about a block away, and the four of us started walking towards my former home. I grew excited at my impending return to the last house I once called home in Cuba and started my final approach towards it. I remembered once learning that a man named Hector had moved into my former house after my grandfather passed away in 1967. I looked forward to meeting Hector and hoped he could provide me with stories about my family's life during the years following our departure from Cuba, his relationship with my grandparents and uncles, and how he came to live in our Apollo house. I hoped he was home this morning. A few steps later, I noticed a man standing behind my home's chain-link gate, lost in conversation with two other persons on the sidewalk in front of him. Once my friends and I caught up with him, the two men on the sidewalk acknowledged us with a simple nod of their heads, excused themselves, and quickly walked away. I come to learn later that this is very common Cuban paranoia of strangers. The man inside the gate, however, turned his body to face us, smiled. I smiled back. I shook his hand and said, "Good morning." "Good morning to you too," he replied. I paused for a moment, nervous, cleared my throat, and softly asked, "Is your name Hector?" "Yes," he answered politely. "And you are?" "Mario Cartaya Mateo," I responded, using my paternal and maternal surnames for family identification. Hector grew pale, gave me a long look, smiled broadly, walked through the gate onto the sidewalk, stood next to me, and then said, "Mario Cartaya Mateo, I've been waiting for you a long time." I had prepared myself to expect the unexpected during this trip, and I knew I would face moments that would challenge me, but Hector's greeting was different than anything I could have ever imagined. I just stood there on the sidewalk in front of my Apollo home and looked at him completely dumbfounded. I had no idea what he meant. Realizing the importance of this serendipitous moment, I took a deep breath, shelved my emotions, and nervously asked, "Hector, what did you mean when you greeted me with, 'I've been waiting for you a long time'?" He goes, "Don't you know?" I said, "No." He goes, "Well, of course you wouldn't. When your uncle, Mark Colin, his best friend, turns out, discovered that your grandfather's illness was terminal, he did not want your house to be confiscated by the government, so he allowed my wife and me to move into your family's home. I, in turn, agreed to take care of your house and family possessions until the day you returned to the United States. Of course, no one thought it would take long." "Hector, I'm not here to stay. I'm only visiting," I told him. It's still good to have you here, Mayito. That's little Mario, right? Please come inside your house. There's a few things I want to show you. Hector concluded and led my friends and me into his home. Once in the living room, Hector placed one of his arms around my shoulders, smiled proudly, and said, "Look around. Do you recognize anything?" "Yes, I do," I responded, recalling every door, room, and window around me. Even the floor tiles and wall colors were the original finishes from when I lived here 56 years before. Nothing had changed. Hector had amazingly kept a promise he made my uncle 5 decades ago. Our home, as well as the contents stored inside, was still here quietly awaiting my family's return from our life of exile in the United States. In front of me, once again, after 56 years, incredibly untouched during that time, were the furniture and household goods synonymous with my life in this house. The living room and dining room furniture, designed and built by my grandfather, were still there, as well as the drinking glasses, coffee cups, and pastel-colored 1950s dishes and dining utensils my family used daily, now stared at me in lonely silence. Tangible evidence of everyday items from my preteen years were suddenly within my reach once more. An immense wave of nostalgia wave over me, and I let my feelings out. Loyalty, honor, and gratitude. I thought about how Hector had lived with his family in this house for 5 decades, honoring a promise he made my uncle to protect and maintain our home and personal property until the day of our return, never giving in to the temptation to sell any of it in order to help his family during Cuba's many periods of severe shortages. Who keeps that kind of promise for 50 years? Hector did, a loyal family friend. Soon it was time to go, and I left my Apollo home once more. Visiting my Apollo home on my first day back was a sobering reminder of my family's departure from Cuba, the anticipation of a prompt return never to be, the integrity of the men my uncle chose to care for our home during our time in exile. It was, of course, a sad testament to the systemic family separations that continues to define the horrible Cuban diaspora today. But it was foremost a tale of Cuban brotherhood, family ties, loyalty, and honesty, spanning the Florida Straits and conquering the test of time and politics. A beautiful story of hope, perhaps even inclusive of a future Cuban reconciliation. Now I want to take you with me to the cemetery, trying to go back and pay homage to my family member. This part I call the curious case of Julio and Isabel. It took approximately 20 minutes for our groundskeeper turned guide. You go to Cuba and everybody is doing several jobs, right? Anything for additional money. To find the first quadrant marker. Don't forget, Colón Cemetery was laid out in the 1800s by the Spanish monks. So he had to find the quadrant marker, ascertain the inscribed compass direction, and walk the recorded number of 19th century Spanish monk paces, leading us to the 1924 gravesite containing the remains of Julio Cartaya, the paternal grandfather I never knew, and who died when my father was only 4 years old. We found it. Actually, he found it. I just followed him. Surprisingly, Julio's name was not engraved on his script. Isabel Russo, his wife, and my paternal grandmother's name was. Sensing my confusion, our moonlighting groundskeeper put his sweaty arm around my shoulder and calmly reassured me, Mario, I know it looks strange, but in Colon Cemetery it is customary to engrave the names of the property owners on the crypts. The interred are identified on tablets placed above the tombs. I know it's different than what you're used to in Miami, but don't worry, it's just the way things are done around here. Discovering my grandfather's tomb was engraved with my grandmother's name was a most surreal and ironic moment for me. With her name chiseled on the granite crypt containing her husband's remains, and because she long ago decided never to date again or remarry, I was certain my grandmother intended to one day be buried here with him as well. I mean, she had no reason to expect otherwise. The winds of political change, however, would unexpectedly sweep through Cuba in 1959, ushering in a new era incompatible with our continued lives there. After a few years after my parents, brother, and I emigrated from Cuba, my grandmother followed us to the United States, leaving her country, her crypt, and her husband remains behind. 40 years ago, we buried her in Miami. The sad reality of the Cuban diaspora is that Julio and Isabel, once meant to rest in perpetuity together, are buried in different countries, forever separated by about 200 miles. Both burial markers, remarkably enough, will always bear my grandmother's name. This one is very fitting for this talk today. I call it the promised steps never taken. When I was a young boy, my father would often drive me past the University of Havana, point to the monumental steps leading to the school's entrance portal, and tell me, Mayito, someday you will climb those steps and attend college here and become an architect. I would often imagine how proud my family would feel the first time I'd walk through the alma mater statue and marble portal at the top of those steps and onto the university grounds, signaling my transition from a schoolboy into a college student. Unfortunately, it was never meant to be. Instead, I attended the University of Florida, where I excelled in my studies and graduated magna cum laude from a School of Architecture, realizing my Cuban childhood dream of becoming an architect. I owe the refinements of my talents, intellectuality, and professional career to my education at the University of Florida. I am and will always be a Florida Gator. Still, in my original universe, I would have been thrilled to have attended my predestined school. During the time it took to drive the short distance to the University of Havana, I grew increasingly excited at the thought that today, 56 years after leaving Cuba, I would finally walk up the steps my father once assured me I would one day climb and enter the school I once dreamed of attending. On May 18, 2016, I proudly walked up the University of Havana's monumental steps, deliberately and slowly, completing each step never taken. By the time I entered the campus through the school's marbled entry gateway, with the University of Havana carved into its facade, I realized I had finally taken my promised steps. I never imagined it would have taken so long. So now, in conclusion, I'm coming home from my return trip, and this is what I learned, right? Our airplane roared down the runway and soon became airborne, bringing us closer to our loved ones in the United States with every passing minute. I thought about how even though I had traveled inside a country still under the control of the same oppressive government responsible for 6 decades of intolerance, economic failure, and the Cuban diaspora. I had also found a nation of people hopeful for a change that would improve their daily lives and willing to extend new bridges of friendship and reconciliation over the imaginary historical canyon that still divides us. All week I basked in the warmth of the Cuban people, their acts of goodwill, quick smiles, and offerings of brotherhood. Welcomed me back with an undeniable spirit of friendship and acceptance I never expected. That was good enough for me. I chose to forgive those who might have once wronged me and shed the preconceptions, hate, and prejudices that for too long had tormented me from inside my protective subconscious vault. I thought about how 7 days ago I started this journey to Cuba, thinking only of my pain and worrying exclusively about my needs, neglecting to consider the reality and struggles of the Cubans living on the island today. My experiences in Havana this week changed all that. I learned that Cubans on both sides of the Florida Straits lived equally anguished by the painful family separations of the Cuban diaspora. For every Cuban American who once left family members behind, there's a person living in Cuba missing those loved ones who fled the island. In my case, my family died and never saw me again. I discovered how the daily lives of Cubans who chose to stay behind were exponentially more difficult than those of us who once made the painful decision to leave. The unabated economic struggles and lack of opportunities that have historically limited every breath of those living on the islands continue to define their existence as victims of a failed and non-evolving political dogma. Moreover, I realized that while most of us who emigrated from Cuba lived on lands with social freedoms, advancing technologies, and progressive infrastructure, those who stayed behind continually endured the ups and downs of a country forever stuck like a broken watch in 1959. My journey to Cuba this week also taught me that, like me, most Cubans on the islands lived with a similar protective subconscious vault, sheltering them from their unpleasant memories, struggles, and painful family separation. Unlike me, however, they lived on an island historically surrounded by an invisible territorial vault, encasing them within an isolated and forbidden place with no way out. That's why year after year, thousands of Cubans seek to immigrate abroad in order to escape their suffocating realities, claim their lives denied, reverse their stunted personal growths, and find new meaning in their personal existence. After all, it is a singular Cuban story. Cubans on both sides of the Florida Straits, now I understand, have a lot more in common than I ever thought. We're all victims of the same failed revolution. I long for a day when the dream of change would become a reality, improving the quality of life for Cubans everywhere, in Cuba and abroad, and relegating all protective subconscious vaults like mine as forever unnecessary. Thank you.
We would like to open up the floor to have questions that the audience might have, but just to spark conversation and get the process started. I had the chance to read the book, like I told you prior to starting today. Very compelling. I was able to read it in basically in a day and a half, and it was really powerful, accessible, And relatable because it taps to humanity at the end of the day. It's a book that's about humanity
Humanity.
at the end of the day. And keeping that in mind, I have a series of questions just to get the conversation started. And there's an element of peace or being at peace. In that regard, I have two questions. One, when did you know it was the right time to go back? Right? What was your state of mind, of your emotions, when you knew this was the time? So that's one question. And then one of your friends that traveled with you, it seems, according to your description, that he wasn't able to find peace. So I would like to start a conversation tonight addressing that element of what motivated you at that precise time to go back, and how were you able to manage being at peace after all that your family went through?
There were a number of things that happened within a very short period of time that got me thinking, right? John Kerry, the Secretary of State, asked me to be part of a committee that included a lot of Cubans in Miami to try to be a sounding board for the Obama administration on his return to Cuba, his rapprochement trip to Cuba, and I was a part of that. But during breaks and all, I had a lot of conversations with Secretary of State Kerry about his experience going back to Vietnam and what he found when he went there, meeting with other lieutenants from the Vietnamese side, and him finding peace on that trip. And that got me thinking. When the entourage went with Obama, they asked me to go. I did not go. I didn't think it was proper for me, never having returned to the land of my birth, to go back on a political journey. I had not gone back in 56 years, and I had not yet thought that it was the time to go back, if ever. And then I sat in my living room with my son, and I watched Obama speak to the Cuban people. And he started by quoting the words of Jose Marti. Jose Marti, to us Cubans, is probably the most wonderful poet. He's really the voice of all of us. And he starts it with, Obama started with Obama starts it with a Jose Marti poem that talks about cultivating a white rose that he's going to give to a friend. But he's also going to cultivate a white rose to give to his enemy. That's a poem that all of us in Cuba, in elementary school, learn. It's a beautiful poem of redemption, right? Of peace, of just making friends with enemies. And he started with that, and the tears began to flow. And I turned to my son and I said, buddy, I'm going to have to go back. If an American president can go there and say that, why can't I? At the same time, I have my conversations with Kerry in the back of my mind. Find your peace. It was time for me to try. I was very nervous going there, of course, with my relationships, not just with American presidents, but also with presidents of other countries. Who knows what might have happened? I had that fear, right? Or what am I going to do if I'm confronted? What would my father think of me returning? And do I really want to do this? Again, I didn't know what I would find. I just knew I had to try. What's the worst that can happen? I don't like it, and I come back? Okay. At least I tried. So I went back with that in mind, and what I realized is that those demons from 1960 were long gone. Everything had changed. The people welcomed me. They became friends. They did nothing short of just accommodating me, entering the homes that used to be my homes where they lived, or, the school. I was allowed to walk through school everywhere I went. They didn't have to do that, but they did. And by the time that I left, I had found a peace. I stopped hating. I stopped being fearful. And I began to feel a hope for the future. I met all these wonderful young men in a club at night, a private club, and they were all paying $7 a glass of rum. I began to ask these people, how can they afford to do this? They all had private businesses. They all dreamed of el cambio, the change that I talk about. That gave me hope. Of course, later, all that hope gets squashed. But at least we all had hope for just a beautiful, small period of time. And to this day, I feel an inner peace I never knew I needed.
Another crucial element of the text is the role of memory, right? What you remembered and what happened once you encountered face-to-face people, locations, etc. And you do mention in the book how you had to contend with the memories that were your own and also your family's memories.
Mm-hmm.
How did you reconcile both? You offered the example of food and visiting Varadero. How did that play out emotionally and in your mind, reconciling your memories as an 8-9-year-old and the memories as part of the diaspora? How did that play out once you were there in situ at the location?
It's really interesting. The book, you need to know, is being used in different universities as a psychology book because of what the vault is. We all have a vault. Now, if you're lucky, there's only those ex-girlfriends or boyfriends or wives or husbands in there that you kind of forget about. But in my case, it was a lot more than that. It was the trauma that a just turned 9-year-old kid would face in having to change everything that he thought of himself. But it's interesting. Everywhere I went, the stimulus would return the first memory. And then once you remember the first memory, then 2 memories came back. And then 4 memories came back. So what would start as drips, and I call it that in the book, what would often begin as a drip will become a wave in no time of these memories that come back, because all those memories are inside you. Now, what happened to me is very interesting, and I did not know until I finally talked with one of these professors from an Ivy League school who said, Mario, you know what happened to you, don't you? I said, no. Here's what happened to me. Most of us go back to those memories, and along the way, we begin to forget certain things. Voices, right? Sounds, smells, details, but your mind begins to make bridges. Things that are untrue, but it kind of goes with the story just to keep the story alive. That's why witnesses are so difficult when it comes to any court case, right? What happened to me is I got to the U.S., immediately realized I have to become somebody else just to fit in. I did not think of any of these memories for 56 years. I had never built those fake bridges in my story. So when the memories come back, with the stimulus of the places that I went, they came back pristine. In the book, I talk about it. I remembered not just what happened, I remember the voices of the people talking to me, and even more, I remember what I felt as a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old. You know, that innocence, that willingness to prove your family right, to have your teacher like you, to have your other friends want to play with you, all those innocent feelings that we all forget, it was all buried inside that protective space in my mind. And they were released. And it was just a beautiful gift that very people ever experienced, because we live in a society where we destroy, we rebuild. Right? Any house from the 50s has been renovated 10 times or bulldozed and replaced by a condominium building. Right? Not in Cuba. You go there and everything is still 1959. So for me, it was perfect to go back to a place where everything was unchanged and all the memories would come back. The conscious would tell the subconscious, he's here, release him. And they would come as a drip and then as a flood. It's a beautiful experience. There were times that it was difficult, you know, and especially in Varadero. But yeah, or especially in the cemetery, not just with my Cartaya grandfather, but when I went to visit the maternal family that I used to live with, all of them. And that was a closure 56 years in the making. That was one of those items that I released from my vault that allowed me to find that inner peace. I remembered something, kneeling in my other family's gravesite, praying and telling them about my life, my wife, my kids, my grandchildren. I talked to them. And then I remembered something I had not remembered in 56 years. When they started to die, when my uncle died, and then my grandfather died, and then my grandmother died, all within 8 years. With the first death, my father told me, Mayito, your mother is really so. I imagine you can't even call them to tell them you love me, that you love them. You know they're dying because you got a telegraph that said, your mother is dying. That's it. You can't call, you can't go, you can't send anything but a telegraph. That's it, right? So now I'm telling them the stories that they never heard. But I remember my dad telling me, Mayito, your mother is succumbed by grief. Whatever you do, don't make it worse. You need to be a big boy. Don't cry. I never cried. I had forgotten that. That was also in my vault, the repression of your feelings, right? And now I'm telling them all this, and the memory came back. And the floods opened. All the crying I did, all that release, got it out of the vault. Mm-hmm. What was that replaced with? That closure with an inner peace, right? It's all about human emotions and finding the peace.
And then one element that also comes through in the text is what you mentioned about how things, to a certain extent, hold still in Cuba, right? You said of a broken clock. I think you mentioned that at one point. Your formation here as an architect here at UF, how did that prepare you in any capacity, or your experiences as a student here on campus prepared you for this visit that maybe you didn't realize, but once you came back and assessed the travel and the experience made you realize that the perspective of an architect, right?
My time here in Florida was just about as building my new character, my new self, as anything else that I experienced. It wasn't just my professors who saw something in me and encouraged me along the way to reach my original Cuban dream of being an architect, but also my friends here. Of course, I had American friends, I had friends from everywhere, but all of my Cuban friends that were with me during the early 70s, we all had something to prove, didn't we? We're the first generation coming in from our parents who brought us here, losing everything they had, including their dreams, so that we could have our own. So we all had that chip that we had to prove our parents right. So we had to be not just great students, but the best students. And that peer pressure, or that peer love that we all had, is one of the things that then forced me to become the architect that I became, but also my American roommates, my American friends taught me how to be an American. I often say that I came to the University of Florida 10 years after arriving from Cuba as this Cuban kid from Hialeah, wanting to prove he belonged. I graduated all these years later, an American architect. That's the change it had in me.
Yeah.
Now, Cuban architecture, I loved, and that's what made me want to be an architect when I was there. I grew up with a family that was very into the arts, and they talked about art and architecture enough that I understood what I was seeing. The colonial architecture, the Art Deco architecture, all that. I knew it at a very young age. Here, I learned more about it. I studied it. So now I'm going back, not just to discover the buildings that originally gave me the goal of becoming an architect, but now I go back knowing what they are and why they were built and how they were built and what their expression in society is. Just a beautiful, wonderful addition to my experience.
Yeah, it's a more texture and layer to that experience, right?
Absolutely.
I would like to open up the floor if we have questions from the audience. We have a microphone available, I understand, and we'll be happy to facilitate that conversation. We have a hand here.
I just want to say thank you so much for this talk. It was definitely very inspiring. As someone who also immigrated to the States when I was 9 years old, I have often experienced feelings of I'm not fully Spaniard, but I'm not fully American either, right? It feels like my identity is sort of like in a plane in the middle of the Atlantic, and I don't know what culture I belong to because in my household we speak a language, but when I step out, I speak another. So my question to you is, have you ever experienced those feelings? And if you have, what advice do you have for someone who is currently going through those feelings, especially growing up?
My whole life. My whole life, right? Even coming here with my Cuban friends, my American friends, my architecture friends, my going out to Dubs and celebrate friends. You know, you guys remember Dubs? It was a great club that was here at the time. But I'll tell you this, one thing I learned on this trip. I had always gone by the accepted American title of I'm a Cuban-American. Here's what I learned. Of course, not remembering my Cuban life, there was nothing to question. I am an American, really. I remembered nothing of my Cuban life, but okay. I'm a Cuban-American. I like Santana, so that goes okay with that, right? But here's what I learned. I am not a hyphen name, and neither are you. I am a Cuban. When I'm with my Cuban friends, I'm an American. When I'm with American friends, I am too. The first 8 years of my life are all Cuban. And the next 56 years of my life are all Americans. I'm both. And it's beautiful because I am the best of two cultures. And that's what you are. You're a Spaniard and you're an American, right? Now, in my case, we talked a little bit about this before. My great-grandparents, all four of them, were from northern Spain. I grew up in a house where the Spanish culture, in addition to the Cuban culture, was also very strong. Every Sunday, we had my family dinner, just like Spain, and we ate the sardines, the sardines with a ginger ale, my parents' sardines with beer, just like in northern Spain. And then we had Spanish food, paella, and then, of course, wine that had to be Rioja, wine from northern Spain, and then we had Turron. You know, I mean, I grew up in that. So maybe I am three cultures, right? Maybe I'm Spaniard. When I was in northern Spain just recently with my grandson who wanted to learn a little more about his heritage, I took him with my wife to northern Spain, right? And I gave him sidra, and I gave him wine. It was 8. I gave him sidra. I gave him a little bit of wine. Why? Because it's our culture. You know, you don't give them enough to get drunk, but it's a little bit of wine so they can taste it, and you teach them. Red wine you drink with this and this and this, and white wine you drink with this. And you teach them the taste of wine so wine does not become an alcoholic beverage to get drunk on. It becomes an alcoholic beverage of culture to eat a fine meal by. That's the way I learned. So I was kind of teaching my grandson about that. So, my dear, you're both, and they can both coexist very nicely because that's who you are.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you, sir, for a very interesting talk. It seems to me, well, you are a victim of the Cold War. Your family was a victim of the Cold War. And there were many other victims, not just from Cuba, but Germany, for example, and other places that were divided by the so-called Iron Curtain. But the thing is, sir, the Cold War ended for everyone but Cuba in 1990 or 91. And it seems to me that the reason that Cuba is still not integrated into the rest of the world is because people of the Cuban diaspora here in Florida and elsewhere are determined to keep on punishing the Cuban people over the demons that you told me disappeared when you went to that country. And it makes me feel so sad because my country, I'm American, born here, did this terrible thing to your people. And after a long history of interfering in Cuban affairs. And so I guess I want to apologize, but I wonder what your thoughts are on that topic.
Oh, you don't have to apologize. History is history. And the truth of history is the truth of history. And you can't color truth with everything. Cuba has not evolved. They haven't. They missed the Industrial Revolution, and now they're missing the electronic revolution. They tried to stay true with an economic system that has never worked, and they tried to stay true in a dictatorship that has suffocated Cuba's life. However, we've had 64 years where different people have tried different things, whether it is trying by not doing anything, thinking, if you don't do anything and the Cuban people starve, it'll explode. You hear a lot of that, right? But it hasn't happened. Maybe we should invade, but that has never happened because there's a doctrine that keeps us from going there. Obama tried diplomacy, and then it didn't work, right? So it's not for lack of trying, it's for lack of trying everything, and nothing seems to have worked. I'm still hopeful that it will work because I met the people, and the people want change, and the people believe that there's a change coming. And you know that no government has lasted forever in the history of the planet. No dictatorship has lasted forever. There's always a point of evolving. And I live hopeful, and I live with the Cuban people, that the best change that can happen to Cuba is from inside, not through war, not through famine, but through an evolving of the system. And maybe it will happen someday. We all need to talk about that. We all need to address that issue because ignoring has never been the answer. And those of us that came with me during the early 60s that have heard all of this in the 64 years that we've been here, We know that truth all too well. So thank you for your question. I hope I answered.
We have, I think, one more hand. One and two hands, yes.
First of all, thank you. This is very interesting to hear about your story. So I had a question. I'm a first-generation American. My parents moved here from Brazil, immigrated almost 30 years ago now. And I was wondering why you made the decision to travel back to Cuba with your friends and maybe not your family. And has your family, like your son, your grandkids, ever expressed the desire to go back with you and revisit? I myself sometimes think about like the world where I grew up in Brazil, where I was born there and lived there as only a Brazilian. And I wonder if your family has also experienced any of those emotions.
Obrigado. Originally, I was going to go alone. And the reason for that is a guy that had done the things I had done. And that is, you know, my experiences with American presidents and presidents of other countries as well. Traveling back to that country, I did not know if I was safe. But at the same time, I grew weary of allowing that dictatorship to rule me one more minute. I had to find myself. I had to know who I really was, not just who I became. So I was supposed to go alone. And then one day, one of my friends, an engineer that did a lot of work with me for, 25, 30 years, George, in the book, he says, Mario, I want to go to Cuba with you. And I said, George, you don't want to go to Cuba with me. I don't know if I'm safe, and it's going to be very emotional for me, what I find. And then he said, Mario, I was not born in Cuba. My parents were, and I grew up hearing all this about Cuba. I know you're going back to find your childhood. I never had a childhood in Cuba. I want to be there when you find yours, because that would have been my childhood, he said. I want to see Cuba, no, I want to discover Cuba through your eyes. Broke my heart. What a great friend. How can I say no to him? So I said, okay, George, if you want to go to Cuba that bad, come with me. And then the next day I get a phone call from my other friend who used to work for me, an architect, worked for me for 17 years, and then we had a little firm that we started in Miami. And he says, I hear you and George are going to Cuba. I'm not staying behind. I want to go party. Jose, I know you. Jose takes a party with him anywhere he goes. I know you. I'm not going there to party. I'm going there because I really need to find myself. This is personal with me. Because I know. But here's why you need me, he said. During the day, we'll belong to you, George and I, he said. We'll go anywhere you want to go. We'll do anything you want to do. And then at night, we'll be there for you. We'll be there to hug you, to toast with every great news you're going to find. But at night, you belong to us. So now what do I do? Actually, he wasn't that far off. So I asked my wife, what do you think? And I'm fully expecting to have the excuse to tell Jose, no, you don't want to. No, that's a great idea. You're going to need someone at night to kind of balance, the emotions of the day. So I said, okay. So the three of us went. And the book tells you everything about the relationship that we did and why that combination proved to be genial for me. The next year, now that I know I'm safe, I took my wife. I did not want to take her on the first trip because I'm Cuban. I could talk my way out of any problem if you give me enough time, but my wife is American. And I did not know how she would feel facing something that is so outside her comfort zone, right? But I did go with her in 2017, and I redid the trip with her. Then in 2019, I took my son and my daughter. So I did go with them, just when I thought it was the right time, that was safe for me to go with them.
Thank you. We have one more question.
And our final question.
That was very powerful. I really enjoyed that. I appreciate it very much. You mentioned, or you referred to the opening with the Obama administration and then the political side of things kind of closing back down. But the private sector entrepreneurs that you met that were there, that whole private sector is really beginning to emerge in Cuba, and it's going to be a powerful force down there. And I wonder if you could offer any observations on that.
In a very big way. In the years 2015 to 2019, 500,000 private businesses were formed. These were all Cuban private businesses. The Cubans had this dream that capitalism was here. And then everything ended. Now imagine, anyone under the age of 64, born in Cuba, never knew a system of government that was not Castro's revolutionary system. Anyone under 64 had no idea. But they learned. There were many groups of Cubans in Miami, including the Cuba Study Group and others, many other individual people, that began to teach them what capitalism was. And they took to it with a zest that was really amazing. So imagine having all those dreams for 4 or 5 years, and then poof, they're all gone. We know that many of these Cubans that have come here lately, when you ask them, they'll tell you that. My dreams were squashed. We thought that this thing was ending, and yet it wasn't. But many remained behind. And now you have a capitalist sector that has taken over, not because the Cuban government has any kind of philosophical reason to have it, but because they can't afford to pay every Cuban the $30 a month they used to get before everything changed. So to them, they have no choice but to turn to capitalism. And right now, more Cubans work for private industry than they do for the government. First time since 1959. So there is hope. There is hope. Now we'll see what happens.
Wow.
And if I may say, what we should do is work with those people. Forget the government, but encourage the private entrepreneurs. Teach them, help them, so that capitalism can finally thrive, and then we'll see what happens to everything else. We should be helping these people, not just us, but every country in Europe, everyone that wants to see a change should be helping the private entrepreneurs, the Cubans, not the government so much, but the private entrepreneurs.
On that note, we would like to thank.
Yes.
Oh,
Thank
go
you,
ahead.
Dr.
Yeah.
Suarez. Just wanted to thank you both this evening. Thank you so much for moderating. And Mario, thank you for being here with us. I think we can all say we enjoyed the conversation. And I wanted to let all of you know that he will be staying a little bit afterward if you'd like to connect and ask more questions. I saw some other hands in the audience. So thank you and good night.